Okay, so we're just streaming it live now. Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Jody Williams. I am one of the co-chairs to FNMI EAO. And I just want to thank everyone for taking the time to come out and be part of this important discussion. A little tiny bit about our organization in case you're unaware. We are a subject association known as the First Nations Métis Inuit Education Association of Ontario. We do lots of work such as this evening, putting on webinars, creating resources, and supporting K-12 education in the area of Indigenous education. And we also do some work to support post-secondary as well. So this is our website, fnmieao.com. And one of the important aspects of our organization is that it is guided by an Elders Advisory Council. This council is made up of elders from all over the province, many of whom are residential school survivors, many of whom are still fluent in their language, and also work in various aspects in supporting education. And so all of the work that we do and the resources that we produce are vetted through our Elders Council. And so it's really, we are very proud to be able to work alongside with incredible people. And we have one of those incredible people with us here tonight, Morris Switzer, who's going to be starting us off. But just before I turn it over to Morris, as mentioned, there is going to be a giveaway. So at the end of this session, you will be able to win one of these 3 books with the 3 authors that are here with us tonight. So for those of you who are joining in the chat room, or sorry, joining in on the YouTube side, you will find in the description box, if you may have to click on the show more feature, but in that area, you will find the link that you can use to enter your name and email. And for everyone here on the Zoom side of things, I've just popped it into the chat box, and you can also use that link to enter to win a book. So you just click on the link and fill out your name and email, and we'll do that at the end. And the second link that's going to be shared, and again, on the YouTube side, you will find this in that description box. And for those of you here on the Zoom side, we will put that in the chat box. And I'm going to ask Tina if you can just put that link. And this link is questions that you want to bring forward to our guests here tonight. So we've turned off the chat feature on the Zoom call just because we would like to use this form to streamline your questions, and then we'll share those on to Morris, who's going to help to moderate those. So we'll keep those links. We'll add them in a few times for those who are still entering into the session so that they also get the links. Okay, so that's it for that part. And I'm going to stop my screen share here. And I'm going to turn it over to Morris.
Oh, Miigwech, Jody, and welcome everybody who's joining this session. It's going to be really interesting. This is a very timely conversation we're going to have. And but before we start, I'm going to introduce myself in the language, because we try, those of us even who aren't particularly fluent in the language, we know how important it is that people as often as possible hear Indigenous languages, because they're still here. They're still alive, and it's our job to keep them alive. So I'm going to introduce myself. I'm going to greet everybody as friends. I'm going to, in Anishinaabe, I'm going to tell you that there's a name I've been given other than Morris Switzer, which is my driver's license name. I also have a name that the government of Canada calls me 16000870001. So I say my friends can call me 16 for short. That's my nickname, 16. And I'm going to say I have two clans. I have through my grandfather Moses Muskrat Marsden, who was the chief at the Alderville First Nation in the first decade of the 20th century. I have Muskrat clan. That was his name, Waubgeshig. Through my great grandmother Esther Hill from Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, I have a Quaho or Wolf clan. And I'm also very proud of my Jewish heritage on my father's side. And Happy New Year to everybody. That we're in the second year of Jewish New Year, so Happy New Year, everybody. I was at a New Year's ceremony, Rosh Hashanah ceremony, and the person who was acting as the rabbi was talking about how the people of Israel were the world's first monotheists, the first people to believe in one God. And I corrected him. I said, no. Indigenous peoples have been monotheists since time immemorial. So he wasn't aware of that. So it was a teachable moment for him. And I live in North Bay. I'm in Sudbury now for a meeting of an organization that's looking after Indigenous issues in primary healthcare. And I've lived there for 22 years. And so I'm going to give you that greeting. Ani Bojo, Niji, Benezi Dijnakas, Wajash Dodum, Michisagi Ganashnabek, Anquaro Dodum, Ganye Gahaga, Hudnashoni. Alderville Donjiba, North Bay, and Diana, Anishinabek, and now. And just before I introduce our guests, one of the pictures that you saw of our circle of knowledge keepers, his name is Douglas Sinclair from up in G3 territory, and Douglas is having open heart surgery tomorrow morning. So our thoughts are with Doug. He knows the medicines. He and his partner Kathy are wonderful teachers, and they hold a lot of knowledge about our natural surroundings, and so we're wishing him well. So I have known Waubgeshig Rice for a long time, and he the first place that I actually visited, I had been in the mainstream daily newspaper business for many years, and as I was transitioning into a new path to work with First Nation communities in communications, I somehow got called by people from his community of Waubgeshig First Nation, which is near Parry Sound, Ontario, for me to come and help them with some communication issues, because they were having some challenges on their First Nation. Some of them dealt with educational issues, and they wanted someone to give them some assistance in communication. And so that was the first time I visited the community, and I met this wonderful woman named Eileen Rice, who I much later found out was Wob's Nokomis' grandmother. And so I tell this story by way of saying that Wob comes from really good stock, and I remember his Nokomis, his grandmother, sitting around a fire with her, because she was involved with this group. She was the pastor of a little United Church on Waubgeshig First Nation, and yet it was very obvious to me that she had a lot of Indigenous cultural knowledge. And I remember asking her, sitting around this fire one night with her, I remember asking her, do you not find any contradiction in the fact that you're the minister of a Christian church, and you also, obviously, follow very carefully your First Nation, culture? And she said, of course not. That we both, both those spiritual paths believe in one creator, and So she didn't see anything, contradictory in that at all, which is how I feel, by the way, about my Jewish heritage and my Indigenous heritage. But she was a good teacher. And I can't remember, she must have been in her 7th decade at the time, but to help show the way for her community against basically education funds not going where they should go in her First Nation. She and a cousin of Wobb's occupied the band office, and we usually have this stereotype of Indians wearing camouflage and masks, and here was Eileen, this lovely little lady, United Church minister, no less, inside the band office. And good things came out of it. We actually had a story in the Globe and Mail. I helped get a reporter there named Rudy. I'm trying to remember Rudy's last name. And he did a big story about it, which helped create awareness about it, and which helped, I'd like to think, helped to resolve the issue. But so that was Wobb's grandma, and his dad, John, is another really wonderful teacher. He does a lot of work with, has done a lot of work with the Indigenous people who find themselves, in the criminal justice system, which is very important work because we're much overrepresented there. So I know those people, and Wobb's cousin Lucy was the other person in the band office. So when I finally got to know Wobb, it was like it was kind of a familiar face to me, even when I hadn't met him. And I was working at the Union of Ontario Indians, and part of my duties in communications then was being the editor of the Anishinaabe News, and Wobb was one of our freelance writers. I think he was one of our summer interns. A very competent writer. He'd had some experience before I got there, doing some articles for the Anishinaabe News when he was an exchange student, I think in Germany, if I remember correctly. For Dave Dale was the editor at the time, but he was obviously very accomplished and comfortable using words, and I followed with great interest his career from then on, and primarily in journalism. I remember him doing weather reports for CBC, and then he sort of graduated to more serious stories. And I also know that part of his journey working for, the national broadcast organization was encountering systemic racism, which is unfortunately a part of all of our major systems in this country against, with regard to attitudes towards Indigenous peoples. But that was a good learning experience for Wobb, and I'm sure it's helped. It's helped. Helped him be the person he is and the writer he is. So, and the last thing I'll mention about Wobb is that we developed an award about 2002, I think it was, and it was called the Debwewan Citations. And we know that there is an award that it's offered by the Native American Journalists Association in the United States, and it's called the Columbus Award. Since its inception, it's been given to media organizations who've done the worst job in reporting on Indigenous issues. So we thought, let's come from a strength-based perspective, and let's honor people who've done a positive job. And we've had some pretty auspicious people there. The first honoree was Peter Edwards, who devoted a good part of his life covering the Ipperwash hearings presided over by Justice Sidney Linden, and he subsequently wrote a book that exposed a lot of the kind of systemic racism in mainstream politics that led to the death of Dudley George on September the 6th, 1995. And but among the, that illustrious group of people, the last person that I recommended before I retired was Waubgeshig Rice, and I unfortunately wasn't able to be at the event where he was presented the award. But so he's highly regarded as a person who works with words, and he's now working with words in a different way. I never like people calling either nonfiction or fiction creative writing. I think all writing is creative, so I'm really pleased, to be able to introduce Wab to you, and I'll leave it to Wab to introduce, Daniel Heath Justice, with whom he's going to have a conversation about why Indigenous literatures are important, and that's the title of a book that that Daniel has created a couple of years ago, and that has become sort of a handbook for the many school boards where they're introducing literature courses featuring writers like Wab, like like Drew Hayden Taylor. There are many, Richard Waughemis. There are many really talented and capable Indigenous writers. I should mention a woman, Lee Miracle. So I'm going to turn it over to Wab and say I'm just delighted to have this opportunity, Wab, to to say a little bit about you.
Oh, Miigwech Morris, very honored to be introduced by you. My career wouldn't have made it even halfway down the road it was without your leadership, your guidance, your support. I wouldn't have been a journalist without you, for sure. So Miigwech for paving the way for me and for really empowering me to find my voice in journalism. When I was going through school and not quite finished my degree, I had a lot of doubts as to whether I actually wanted to continue to move on, because I encountered a lot of those systemic racism issues in university back in the late 90s, early 2000s, especially in a journalism program. But having an opportunity to report for you and to learn from you and write for the Anishinaabe News and really, hold up our people and our communities and their efforts to, assert their sovereignty in however many ways was really transformative for me, and I thank you to this day, Miigwech, and Morris. He recently received the Dibwewin citation, like long overdue after creating it. So I just one of many accolades that I think Morris deserves. So Miigwech, Morris. And I just want to say Miigwech to Jody and the rest of FNMIEAO for creating this series and for inviting me to be a part of it, to invite some guests in. I think this is a really crucial initiative. And we're at some pretty important intersections at the moment in terms of how we approach Indigenous literature, Indigenous culture, storytelling, and so on through an educational, shoot in some ways, right? And when Jody and I were talking about how to kick things off, I think we all agreed that the ideal person to lead this discussion, to set the tone for what we want to do, is Daniel Heath Justice. And it's also especially cool to have Daniel come in this event. We've known each other for a little while in a couple of different capacities, but I think I first met Daniel at the Indigenous Writers Gathering at the University of Toronto, probably about 10 years ago. And, just very, blown away by Daniel's knowledge, his insights, his views on storytelling, his wealth of knowledge, and so on. And then a few years later, when Moon of the Crusted Snow came out, my most recent novel, my very first event promoting it was at Word on the Street in Toronto, and Daniel interviewed me for it, which was really cool because, someone who I've looked up to for a long time sort of came full circle. Someone who's an expert in literature was able to ask me about my latest book. So I will introduce Daniel, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll get to the submitted questions a little later, and hopefully you all take away some great knowledge, some great great insights and a good spirit from what we're here to share tonight. So Daniel Heath Justice is a Colorado-born citizen of the Cherokee Nation who lives with his husband and their 3 sweet but slightly feral bulldogs in the traditional Swiya of the Sheshelf people. He is a professor of critical Indigenous studies and English language and literatures at the University of British Columbia in unceded Musqueam territory. And he's the author of numerous scholarly works, including Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, the Animal Cultural History Volume Raccoon, and most recently, the co-edited scholarly collection Allotment Stories, Indigenous Land Relations Under Settler Siege. He's also a fantasy novelist, a queer Indigen nerd, and a longtime D&D player, Dungeons and Dragons. So Daniel, welcome to our virtual meeting tonight.
Well, no, thank you so much. What an honor to be here. This Cherokee Nation reservation boundaries behind me. Yeah, just really, really honored. It's always nice to talk with teachers too. And I know teachers have so many things going on. So I appreciate you taking the time because I know you're very busy and underappreciated and dedicated and doing all kinds of things. So it's a real honor to be here. And thanks to the organizers, to Jody and Maurice, and to Wob, who has always been not only an extraordinary writer, but also an extraordinary human being. So I'm very pleased. Yes.
Thank you very much, sir. It's great. It's great to connect with you tonight. So we're here. We're going to dive into your book, Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, shortly. But to kick things off, I just got to lob like a beach ball your way, and just ask, why do Indigenous literatures matter?
So I'm going to go to the very end of the book with my giveaway, because we matter, because Indigenous people matter. Our stories matter, our lives matter, histories matter, lands matter, and so the imaginative works that articulate all of that and share that into the world matters. And I think it matters more now than ever because I think the world needs Indigenous brilliance in a major way.
And just going back for yourself, someone who's so knowledgeable, so passionate about literature, where did it begin for you? What were the books? What were the authors that really compelled you to learn about this way of storytelling?
So it was actually kind of a circuitous route for me because I was raised outside a community. My grandmother was the last person in my family raised on our family allotment, which is kind of over this shoulder here, up here. So my dad and I were both raised outside a community in Colorado. And so for me growing up, literature was what was about everything that wasn't Indigenous. And it wasn't until I went to university that I actually found out that not only did we have literature, we had awesome literature, but I loved story. Like my dad was a really hilarious storyteller. I grew up in a mountain community, and so we had a lot of mountain folks up there who also were storytellers in different ways. So I loved story, but I always kind of thought of legitimate literature in scare quotes as being something that came on a boat from Europe. And it wasn't until I was in university that I was like, oh my gosh, not only are there Indigenous writers writing literature, there are Cherokee writers writing literature. And their stories sound like us. Their stories sound like my family. Sorry, my phone was going off. They sound like my family. They sound like they're talking about things that actually are familiar to me. Even though I was raised outside a community, a lot of the language and everything was kind of like the way my dad talked, the way my aunt talked. And so it was actually a Chicano lit professor who, because I was originally going to go to grad school for Gothic literature, of all things, and he read my my little proposal that I was supposed to send to grad school, and he said, "Son, we need to have a talk." Marcus Embry, I will always be appreciative to him. And he said, "Daniel, just answer me one question. What can you bring to the study of Gothic literature?" And I didn't have an answer for him. And he said, "Why don't you go into native literature?" And I actually said, "You can do that?" I had no idea. This is the what 90s, late 90s. I didn't know, and I had gone through a few years of university, and I didn't know that you could actually study Indigenous literature as a thing. And so I did. I just started going into it, and I had a lot to learn, right? But so always loved story, always compelled by story, but to go into Indigenous literature, it was really in university. But then I also found, so I was very excited. I was going to go into it. Part of it was also a homecoming for me. And there was a Victorian lit professor in the department who I'd never taken a class with. He only kind of knew me because it was a small department. And he knew I was about to graduate, and he stopped me in the hall and he asked me what I was going to do. And I told him I was going to go to the University of Nebraska for Indigenous literature. Well, for Native Lit is how we talked about it at that time. And he looked at me with this really pitying look on his face, and he said, "Daniel, I thought you were a better scholar than that," and turned around and walked off. And I was like, "Oh, okay." So it's probably good to know that at the time. Yeah, so it's kind of a long story, but it's not what I expected to do, but I'm sure glad I did it. And I'm really glad there were so many people along the way who welcomed me into this world.
It's so interesting that those of us of a certain age were quite literally in the dark when it came to Indigenous literature. Like I was in high school in Ontario in the 1990s, and I was not aware that there were Indigenous authors, doing Indigenous literature. I had been familiar, of course, with Indigenous storytellers, Anishinaabe storytellers more specifically in many ways, but going to high school, it was just all white dudes that we read, and so it's heartening nowadays to know that, your book and my book and the books of our peers are being studied in high school. But it took one of my aunties, for me to be exposed to Indigenous literature, right? Because it just wasn't coming through the mainstream education system. So that gets me to my next question for you. When you think about that broad sort of, I guess, journey or route that Indigenous literature has sort of carved out for itself, off the mainstream path, why did you want to answer the question of why Indigenous literature matters in a book? What prompted you to explore that?
Well, it started off actually as a response. So one of my students was writing had a blog and asked me if I would write about this question. And so actually the question came from her. And I wrote on the blog, and I think I had 7 answers. It was very like, this is why, this is why, this is why. And I always kind of sat with that question because I'd never really been asked that, like, why does Indigenous literature matter? And it stuck with me in my head. And I was ready to do another writing project. And I thought, actually that's a good project, is to talk about why Indigenous literatures matter. And I wanted to think of it in the plural, not just Indigenous literature, but think about it like we have a lot of literatures that come from a lot of different communities and a lot of different lands. And so I thought, I think I could write a book about this. But it was also terrifying because, like, this is a big topic, right? And so I approached it very differently for the book. I didn't want to say, this is why they matter, but to say, here are some questions I have, and here are some kind of general themes. And, I might change my mind about some of these things in the future. So kind of treating it as a set of questions to think about rather than answers that you have to get. I think then I could see a book come out of that. I thought, if I have to say this is the definitive reason, well, first of all, I'm not qualified. I will never be qualified to say why this matters for every nation in all communities. Like, that's just not the case. But for me, this is why I believe Indigenous literatures matter. In this moment, in my life, in my time, in my training, in my experience. But another person can write the exact same book and write about completely different texts and come up with different questions to guide them. And that is exciting to me, that it's actually part of a conversation. It's not about a firm statement.
Interesting. I'll ask you about those key questions in a moment. But this book is extremely comprehensive yet concise at the same time. And you explore so many different works that obviously I could never have been totally familiar with. If I lived my entire life reading just Indigenous literature, I would have missed out on so many of these if it weren't for, this book. So, you talked about those key questions, but how else do you go about researching and writing something like this? Just considering like the weight of everything that you wanted to get to.
So I actually had a lot of panic for a while. I signed the contract and then I was like, I didn't touch it for a long time. And my editor was like, "Where's this book?" And I was like, "I have no idea." But part of that was because the weight of it really weighed on me. And then I realized I couldn't be comprehensive. And so the way I focused on it was, okay, and there are so many books I love that didn't get in there. There's so many writers whose work I just adore that didn't get in there. So rather than it be about kind of the best, whatever that looks like, and I'm always really suspicious about those, like, who decides what's the best and by what standards. I thought, okay, what are the books I think I have something to say? So that actually I have some thoughts about right now. What are some of the books that I've really struggled to teach? What are some books that I think more people should love? Who are some writers who maybe are well represented, but they've written something that people should know better than they do? And then also, what are some just weird works that I love and I just want to write about because it's my book and I just want to write about it? And I've realized I'm a little bit of a magpie as a scholar and as a writer. Like I want to find things that have interesting stories to tell and interesting connections. But one thing I did not want it to be was to be seen as like, these are the only writers you need to know about, because I knew there were going to be so many writers to come, and there were so many great writers I wanted to write more about. And I didn't feel like I had the right things to say about them. I didn't think I had enough to say about their works in that moment. But what I wanted to do was to be part of a conversation and to prompt other conversations. And it's actually been kind of neat to see how other writers have taken up the book and taken that conversation further and maybe pushed back on some of my interpretations and maybe expanded some ideas. I did, but that's one of the problems with a book like this. Like when you say why Indigenous literatures matter, you've already painted yourself into a corner in some ways, because it assumes an authoritative stance, even though I was trying to unravel that authoritative perspective.
In some ways, though, I think the way you framed it with those 4 guiding questions, which are, for those of you who haven't read the book, how do we learn to be human? How do we behave as good relatives? How do we become good ancestors? And how do we learn to live together? By engaging the reader with those questions, was that sort of a way to help you focus, to help you sort of make a roadmap for yourself in terms of answering the big overarching question?
It was, yeah. And I think I was just more interested, when I treated it instead of as firm statements, but as open-ended questions, I actually was much more interested, and I felt like I could get momentum on the project. And the questions I brought to different texts kind of surprised me sometimes. Like there are some texts that people might have expected would be talked about in a different chapter with a different question. But I was like, I want to do something that's maybe a little bit unexpected in the approach. And I still ask those questions. I ask those questions in my scholarship. I ask those questions in my teaching, because those are questions, like those are kind of basic teachings that I've understood, that I think are just about helping us live in a good way in the world, and in a way that has some integrity and some responsibility.
As an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous writer, when you step back to analyze this vast movement, this vast body of work, and keeping those intentions and that spirit in mind, how emotional was it for you to create this?
Oh, it was hard. It was hard.
Yeah.
And part of it was I didn't want to leave anybody out, right? And I think that's one of the big challenges too, is you've got so many great people. And a big worry I had was, I think we are not as a field as good at honoring our elders as we need to be. We're great about honoring them when they're gone.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of folks are gone way too soon. And I think, like Lee Miracle was the same age as my mom. My mom died a month after Lee did. And I miss Lee a lot, right? And I wish there were so many things I wish I would have told her. Beth Brandt is another one. And like we've got all of these really incredible people. And I didn't want to not write about somebody and then make them feel like their work had been forgotten, because I think a lot of our elders' work has been pushed to the side. And as there are new and younger writers, I'm glad they're getting attention. I'm glad that they're getting visibility. But I think especially Indigenous women, elders, the aunties, have gotten marginalized, and are some of the key people who do teaching and mentorship and butt kicking and all the things that we need as writers, and who have built the field in a really fundamental way. But oftentimes it's a really limited sphere of guys who get the publicity and the visibility. And I think for me, that was the hardest thing, was just making sure that I was being as inclusive as I could be, but I didn't want anybody to feel like their work wasn't valued or wasn't seen. And I think that was the biggest struggle emotionally for me, was this can't be comprehensive, but it needs to be inclusive in the best way I can be. And I fell short. You're always going to fall short, but I think the spirit of that, I hope, comes through.
Oh, it totally does. And I don't think you fell short at all, especially considering the voices of women. The patriarchy persists in our Indigenous storytelling circles, right? In publishing and so on. People like Lee, Marilyn Dumont, Maria Campbell, still, like, as renowned as Maria Campbell is, I don't think she gets the credit she deserves as a revolutionary author, right?
Yeah.
So I especially appreciated that in your book, and also the two-spirit perspective too, which is crucial at the same time. So just before I don't want to forget about our audience tonight, which is comprised of entirely educators. Bringing it back to who we're chatting with tonight, just broadly, what do you hope educators get out of this book?
That there's so much amazing work that you can bring to bear in your teaching from Indigenous writers from all over the world. One of the biggest frustrations for me in my career as a specialist in Indigenous literature was to hear people say, well, I'd love to teach Indigenous literature, but there just isn't enough out there, or I just can't find it. And I'm like, then you're not looking. And so now, actually, I have a book to say, here you go. There's a bunch of names in here. There are at least 365 names in here that you can look at. Well, I'd say more than that, but then there are a couple of dodgy people who managed to make their way in there. But anyway, there are hundreds and hundreds of names here who span from the 1500s to today. And there are many, many more who are coming of age right now who are not in this book. Never, ever say that you can't find us. If you can't find us, you're not looking for us. So that for me was a fundamental thing. And we are writing about everything under the sun. We're writing about science. We're writing about spirituality. We're writing about popular culture. We're writing about politics, news, sex, gender. We're writing about raccoons, for goodness sake. We're writing about everything. So we are relevant to every field, every discipline, every topic. Now, some of that, it does take a little bit of work to find, but for the most part, not at all. And I think that the world needs this work. It's always needed this work, and we've always produced it. I think there's a myth out there that Indigenous writers kind of have suddenly started writing. Well, no, we've been telling stories in our own traditions since time immemorial. We've actually been writing, depending on the community, for hundreds and hundreds of years. We've been writing in English since the 18th century at least, and French, and Spanish, and other colonial languages. It's not like we haven't been writing. We've been writing for ourselves. We've been writing to Europeans. We've been writing to settler populations. There's a huge archive. So remember that. We have lots of work out there for you. All it means is, the challenge now is, how are you going to narrow it down? There's too many of us. And that's a good thing. That's a beautiful thing.
Oh, it's a wonderful thing. Yeah. One thing, a cliche that has come up a lot in recent years is this renaissance of Indigenous arts, right? Of literature, of film, and so on. And, to me, that suggests that Indigenous arts were dead and now they've been revived. But as you say, they've always been thriving. They've always been there. And it's just only recently that the mainstream has taken note, right? And has started to incorporate more of these voices and stories and art forms and so on. And sort of on that note, Morris mentioned earlier that in North Bay, the school board there has taken on this mandatory course. And here in Ontario, there's a grade 11 course available across all boards that focuses entirely on Indigenous literature, works by Indigenous authors. So, as someone who studied this closely, what do you think of having a dedicated course about Indigenous literature for high school students?
I think a dedicated course is awesome. I'm more hesitant about a required course, not because I don't think it's important, but because I think that puts a huge amount of burden on Indigenous people, and Indigenous educators in particular. And like, a required course without resources is really putting huge labor on already overburdened Indigenous educators, and also allied educators who are often, if they're in a district where there aren't any Indigenous educators who are part of the system, then they are also overburdened with representation. So I think a dedicated course is amazing, but I think we need to be woven throughout the curriculum as well. I don't think it has to be one or the other. But if you're going to be taking a world literature class, you better be reading some Indigenous writers in a world literature class. If you're going to be taking a Canadian literature class, we should be there, and not just at the beginning. If you're going to take an American literature course, we should be there, and not just at the beginning or at 1969 when Scott Momaday gets the Pulitzer. So thinking very much, and for me, it goes back to, there's a Muskogee Creek and Cherokee writer and scholar, Craig Womack from the States, and he talks about, I'm very roughly paraphrasing, that Native literature has often been seen as a branch on the American literature tree. And he said, no, we are the tree. American literature is the branch. And if we change it around and think of, why don't we ground literary studies in Indigenous literature, and then we can talk about Shakespeare, and then we can talk about Atwood, well, or not, I'm not a big fan, but we can talk about a range of other writers and other literary traditions, but start with where we are. Start with the lands and the territories and the relationships that we're already part of, and then start making those connections. It doesn't have to be a hierarchy. It can actually be a relationship.
And there's so much to celebrate, so much to highlight, so much to learn from, and in these literatures, there's just so much beauty and so much wonder. On the other hand, though, Indigenous literature can explore some very sensitive matter, trauma, but also ceremony, intimate ceremonies, knowledge that wasn't, written about before generally. So what's your advice to educators? And you brought up the allied educators and the burden on Indigenous educators too. What would your advice be to educators who may not be familiar with trauma or ceremony or any other of those sensitive topics? How would you advise them to teach these themes and issues with care?
Oh, that's a big one. because I think it's slightly different for each one between trauma and I think one of the things to remember is you don't always know who your Indigenous students are in your classroom.
Mhm.
So talking about trauma, and trauma isn't exclusive to Indigenous people, right?
Mm.
That there are very specific traumas for Indigenous people, but there are also other kinds of trauma. Like if we're talking about sexual violence,
Mhm.
there's colonial violence in that way, but there's other kinds as well. So I think always approach these texts with care, but not as though that's the full story of Indigenous experience. Like Indigenous peoples have had horrendous traumas, but our nation's stories aren't only stories of trauma. They're also stories of survival and endurance and love and passion and hilarity. And I think sometimes where people will go is they focus so much on the trauma because that's the dominant narrative in popular culture.
Mm.
Um, and there's a kind of twisted way in which trauma is seen as the authenticating factor of Indigenous experience and identity. That if you're not traumatized, you're not really Indigenous, or that if you're not traumatized in a particular way. And so I think you have to be really careful with trauma and understanding it as part of an experience, but not the sum total of the experience.
Mm.
Um, and so what I would do if you're kind of coming up against that, actually work with folks, talk with people who are trauma informed, inform yourself about how to teach. And there are a lot of resources out there talking about how to teach about trauma, how to engage it in ways that are honest and thoughtful and straightforward, but not just kind of focusing on it to focus on it. Be careful about the texts you teach. There's a really amazing book, Porcupines and China Dolls by Robert Arthur Alexie. It's a brilliant book. I can't teach it well. It's a book that very much deals with trauma in a very visceral way, and I'm not a good teacher of it. So also understand your limitations as a teacher. I have a grad student who's just written a dissertation chapter on it, and totally like, I think I could teach it now based on this young Mohawk scholar's analysis of it. I think I actually understand it in a way that I didn't before. Um, so also understand, some books you can teach better than others, and some you might be better prepared for. So that would be one piece of advice, is just to draw on the resources that are out there. Don't presume that it's the only story, but don't ignore it either. For the issue of ceremony, be really, really careful there. I mean, the reality is our ceremonies were banned, regardless of whether you're from the States or from here or in other colonized places. Our ceremonies and spiritualities and languages have been under assault and have been actually like legally legislated against for various times. And so our communities are pretty protective of those things, and for good reasons. And so don't do kind of like a faux ceremony. I've heard of people doing that. Like let's have a ceremony in class, and tell me which animal clan you are. What's your spirit animal? I'm like, oh God, how do we start? Where do we go? This is awful. And people don't typically do that out of bad intentions. They do it out of a misunderstanding, but also kind of a deep presumption that there's something kind of childish about our spiritual traditions, that they would not do that to in another tradition. But that's a result of colonization. They've been trained to minimize and to belittle our ways in ways they're not for their own. Just like, our ancestors are in their museums, they wouldn't tolerate their burial grounds being raided and dug up by bulldozers and their ancestors taken and put in a museum. So I think part of it is just think about, like, would you be comfortable with this? And also, not all Indigenous writers are authorized to write about some of these things. Not all Indigenous writers have the capacity to write about these things in the ways that they should and could. I'm very careful about how I write about ceremony. Very, very careful. I wasn't raised in a ceremonial family. I'm a baby Cherokee when it comes to ceremony, right? I'm little. I don't have a lot of knowledge in ways that other people do. And there are people, half my age who have the knowledge of an elder because they were trained and raised in that thing. And so also just being cautious and careful. Don't necessarily presume that you know what ceremony is because you read it in a novel. Sometimes people write about it differently in a novel specifically because they don't want to share the actual details. So those are just some, like, I have so much I could say about that. Like, I could just go on and on and on and on. I have a full lecture about this in my classes, but I think those are some starts anyway. Just treat these things with care and respect, and understand that they're part of the experience of Indigenous peoples today, and should be treated thoughtfully. And if you screw up, learn from it. We're all
Yeah.
going to make mistakes, but make different mistakes in the future.
Yeah. All very insightful. Thanks for sharing all that. And that I wanted to ask another question, but you touched on it in terms of, thinking beyond the classroom and thinking about the relationships you can build with people in your community, to fill in some of those awareness gaps. And I always advise people too, like, be vulnerable. Don't be afraid to make those mistakes, because in some way, I think that's how you're going to be more welcomed, maybe, and more sort of, I think, appreciated and understood by the community that you're trying to serve at the same time. So, great points. So I just have a couple more questions for you, Daniel, for me, and then Morris has questions from the audience, and I know he has some questions himself for you too. I just want to bring up something that we talked about before we went live. Tragically, unfortunately, we are seeing climate change really ravage lands all over the place. You were talking about the drought out west where you are. There's these massive storms impacting, the southern and eastern parts of this continent. Here in Northern Ontario, we have more forest fires than we've ever had before. And these are things that our literature, our Indigenous literature, touches on. We look at how we've overcome apocalypses before, and how to seek renewal or regeneration or find ways to pick up the pieces. But in some ways, it seems like real life is really starting to accelerate and catch up to those catastrophic events. So what do you think about, real life and the catastrophes we're dealing with, and what we've conveyed in literature as Indigenous people?
I think so. I would actually write about this a little differently than I did in my book if I were writing it now, because I think one of the things that's really hit me lately is we're not just talking about the catastrophes to the land. We're also talking about the catastrophes to our relations. Um, and I don't remember where I heard this phrase, but it's really haunted me ever since. It's that so many humans seem to want to create a world that's empty of relatives. And for me, when I think about climate change, that's actually what I'm thinking more and more, is that it's not just about the impact on us. It's about our relationships with our relatives, our other than human relatives. So what does it mean to live on the West Coast in a place with so many of these ancient, beautiful red cedars? And the cedars are woven into the fabric of language and ceremony and life and ritual and all of these different things. And we're probably looking at the end of these cedar forests in the next few generations. Of course, it's going to have huge ecological impacts, but what does it do to our kinship relationships? All of these relatives who are dying because of drought, because of strange, unexpected fires. What happens when we lose the bears? What happens when we lose the deer? What happens when we lose the badgers? All of these creatures, the bats. We're not just losing ecological species and keystone species. We're losing relatives, and we're becoming lonelier in this world. And I think Indigenous writers are articulating kinship in really, really complex ways, and also expressing a kind of existential grief about losing family yet again. And the ties of family that are being unwoven and ravaged not by our own doing. Again, these are, this is being done again by extractive industry. It's being done again by governments who don't see our relatives as having value, except as they can be commodified for money. But I think our stories reaffirm the importance of those kinship relationships. But I think that's one thing we need to be really explicit about. It's not just the lives, it's the lineages, it's the relationships that this idea of being on a lonelier planet, that haunts me a lot. What happens when all our relatives are ghosts?
Yeah. It's quite profound always to explore just the gravity of the impact of colonialism on all of our peoples, right? And that, it's important to highlight that it is ongoing. Even though everyone's going to be wearing orange shirts on Friday, that doesn't mean that that all those issues have been solved.
Yeah.
And just with that evolution of us as Indigenous people, of our stories, of our place in society, and so on. And I asked you specifically about the dystopian sort of element of it because you touch on it so succinctly in your book. My last question is, considering what has changed, who has arisen as Indigenous voices in literature, some of the changing themes, and so on, have you considered writing a second volume to this book?
You know what? No, because I want to know what other people have to say. I think the danger of me writing a second volume is I kind of become the voice in a way that I don't think is appropriate. And I'm kind of getting to be old hat now, right? Like there are so many better voices out there. There are so many younger scholars who are just doing stuff I was never courageous or smart enough to do. And I'm like, I think for me, the exciting thing is, let's have another volume of it written by somebody else. Somebody who's got different kinds of questions and different kinds of influences and, can ask different questions, maybe because I've helped set some of that stage and other writers have helped set that stage, but they're going to go places that none of us could have imagined. And that's why we do this work, is so other people can ask better questions, different questions, and take us to places that we didn't know we could go, but are really grateful to be taken to.
Well, it's really exciting to think of it that way. That's really cool. Well, Chamigwa, Daniel, thank you. Those are all my questions. I'm going to hand it back over to Morris now for more questions, if you're up for it, Daniel.
I'm good. Yeah, well done. Appreciate it.
And thank both of you. And here's a comment involving both of you from someone from the Peel District School Board. They want to thank both you, Daniel, and Wob, for the work that you both do to help educators teach Indigenous literature. Everything you write and every interview you do is a gift that enriches us and our classrooms. Thank you. So that's nice to hear. And a question that's sort of related to that, and I was so glad, Danielle, to hear you in your last few comments talk about relationships, because for me, the overwhelming takeaway in your book was, at their best, Indigenous writers, can talk about different kinds of relationships, better than anybody.
Yep.
Relationships with our relatives, with the land, with one another. One of the most powerful books I've read, and you mentioned her in your text, but not this till. The Watchman by Louise Erdrich. I think it's the best book I've read for years. I think a phenomenal book. I just recommend it to anybody. The Watchman, The Night Watchman, is that what it's called? Yep. But related to, this comment about how helpful you are to teachers, and this is something that I hear a lot from York Region District School Board. What's your advice to teachers who are nervous to teach a course on Indigenous literatures? Nervous in terms of disrespecting or doing the wrong thing?
That kind of fear can be really good, but it can also be really incapacitating. So my recommendation would be, lean into the fear. You're gonna screw up. We all do. Nobody gets it right. Not even those of us who've been doing this work for years and years and years. Because there's no getting it right. There's just doing the best we can do and learning and doing better the next time. So I get nervous too, right? I want to make sure that I'm including as many voices as I can. I want to make sure that I'm not disrespectful. I mean, I've had students who question my choices of texts, and I've changed texts as a result. I remember one year, just the way I had set the books together, I was thinking that they would speak to each other in a certain way. And I had three young women come up to me after class one day, and they were all really nervous but quite determined. And they said, "Is every book by an Indigenous writer about rape?" And like, I just, my breath got taken away. And they said, "Because every book we've read so far has a really disturbing rape scene." And they disclosed that they were all survivors. And I said, "No, absolutely not. And I'm really, really, really sorry." But because I'm not a survivor in that way, that was not something that jumped out at me. And part of that's, a particular kind of privilege. I was looking at other kinds of themes and how they flowed, but for them, they were experiencing something very, very visceral. Of course, then the next book didn't have that, and then we could have that conversation. But that conversation really stuck with me. But the best of intentions, these amazing works, and these were none of these scenes were gratuitous scenes, but when you put them side by side, there was a pattern. And that could happen on any sort of topic, right? And so it just made me more thoughtful about how particular kinds of violence were represented in texts and how particular kinds of experiences were. So I think part of it is also to elicit feedback from your students about how they're reading these things, how they're experiencing them. And then do better the next time. But we're not going to get it right because we're dealing with texts that are grappling with hard things in the world and complicated things and messy things. And, some of these texts are going to really speak to some students and not to others. That's why you want to have as good a range of texts as possible so that people can see the diversity in our communities as well as the diversity in our voices. But don't let your fear stop you. Let it inspire you to always do your best.
Rich, that's good advice. When teachers tell me they're afraid of that, and there is some legitimate nervousness, I say, I'd be afraid to teach trigonometry, but
Yeah.
But I also say gently, just don't pretend to know anything you don't know.
Yes. Yep.
Take that innocence with you. The teachers can be just as innocent as the students in their class about the subject matter, and they shouldn't be. It was drilled into me at First Nation Technical Institute that everybody in a classroom is a learner.
Yes.
Everybody is learning. So, another question, thanks, Daniel, from a teacher librarian in the Kawartha Pine Ridge District School Board. What are some of your favorite books that you would recommend and read to elementary age children?
Oh, see, I'm not a good person for that one. There are other people who are doing much better. Like mine is really kind of more older readers, so young adult and above. So elementary school, I would say. So there is a scholar named Debbie Reese, who's Nambe Pueblo, who has a really great website called American Indians in Children's Literature. And Debbie does work on representations of Indigenous people in children's literature, but also children's literature by Indigenous writers. And she's focused on American Indian, but she includes Indigenous writing from all over the place. So I would actually suggest looking at her recommended books because she has, and I haven't looked at it in a while, so I'm not sure how updated it is. But Debbie historically has always had a year-end post, like the best work that's come out this year in children's literature. So I would look to those kinds of resources, and that has always been a really great resource in my mind, and I've learned a lot from it. But yeah, I'm That's one place where I am woefully ignorant.
That's an interesting point, Danielle, because I think in this day of this era of reconciliation, it's like the classic story of the Indigenous kid in the classroom, and as soon as there's something mentioning Indigenous peoples comes up for discussion, all heads turn toward that one kid. We're not, we're expected, I think, to be experts, on just about every topic that involves Indigenous people. So thank you for being honest. This next question, it actually is, I've had a similar question from a couple of people, someone from the Toronto District School Board, actually two people, I think if it's two people from the Toronto District School Board. I think you've touched on this, but what would you want a teacher to consider as they select books for their students that are by Indigenous authors? Is there anything that they should think of?
I think it's always really good to start with where you are. So what territory are you in? Whose territory are you in? And what writers are speaking from that context? And it's always awesome for students to read about a place that they live in and to actually see it. Like students who, here in Vancouver, students who read Eden Robinson's Monkey Beach, there's a whole bunch of Vancouver in that. And they're like, I know this place. I actually live right there. And it's exactly right. And, it's been years since that book came out, but it's still recognizable. So I would say start where you are. It's also a nice opportunity to give attention to local writers, because a lot of really important work that's happening in Indigenous writing is coming from local writers who don't necessarily have a national national recognition or a national readership, but are actually really important voices for the places that they come from. So it gives you an opportunity to maybe connect with an Indigenous writing group in the area, or to bring visibility to an emerging writer or an established voice who more people should know about. So I would start there. Be a little wary sometimes of the really splashy names out there. I mean, and we can talk, like Joseph Boyden is kind of the clear example, right? Like somebody who's on every single billboard. And that's changed a little bit because I think there's just more visibility in Indigenous writing now. But also think about like who is being privileged and who isn't. And take a look, like, are all the voices that you've chosen men? Cisgender men? Well, that might be something to think about. Are they all light-skinned Indigenous people? That might be something to think about. Are they all writing in English? Well, that might be something to think about, right? So kind of ponder the diversity of voices from the area and nationwide as well. We talk a lot about Indigenous writing, but we're really focusing on First Nations writers and, to a different degree, Métis. But there are also some really amazing Inuit writers who are doing great things as well. And so, I think part of it is know what you want to do. Do you want to introduce them to just Indigenous voices generally? Great, then you can do that. But do you want them to is this to connect them to the importance of Indigenous issues in the region, in the province, in the country? Then I think you have different kinds of questions. But I always think it's best start where you are and then go from there. But know why you're doing this and know what you want students to get out of it. And don't think you're going to be comprehensive. Don't think they're going to get all information from one book. Don't even try that. Sometimes it's good to also be kind of stealthy and like, okay, I'm having trouble getting students to be excited about Indigenous writing. I'm going to introduce them to some really awesome speculative fiction, kind of dystopic climate fiction. Waubgeshig Rice has this really amazing novel, and I'm going to teach it that way, and then they're going to be introduced to these topics. They're going to get excited, and then we're going to talk about Indigenous issues and Indigenous concerns, but we've come at it through a genre lens, even though it's not, I wouldn't say that it's strictly genre at all, but we've come to it through a thematic lens that seems recognizable, and then we kind of come around and say, well, this is why this matters, and then you can kind of move in that direction. And I think sometimes when things are treated like, now you have to read Indigenous literature and you have to deal with all the seriousness of Indigenous literature, a lot of students are like, just like teachers are nervous, students are nervous too. I don't want to say the wrong things, but if you're like, this is just an awesome story, read this awesome story, and then we can talk about Indigenous concerns as part of the story rather than as this big ethical weight that they somehow have to figure out when they don't know what to do with it, a lot of them. And some Indigenous students are in that space too. You know, a lot of us were raised outside of our communities with ambivalent relationships to our indigeneity because of a lot of the anti-Indigenous racism. And so Indigenous students too are sometimes struggling with these texts and feeling not Indigenous enough because they don't get it, right? Even though they won't necessarily always get it because they don't necessarily have those teachings, and that's no fault of theirs.
You make a really interesting point, because a lot of Indigenous artists feel that having that word Indigenous in front of what they do it predisposes people to think about what their work should look like. Like they think that Indigenous art should look like something that Norval Morrisseau did, and that's an interesting take. Me go back for that. There's I think you've answered 2/3 of this person's question. They want to know, if someone from the Waterloo District Board wants to know the 3 most important things you would want teachers to know, do, or teach. I think you've touched on the do or teach. What do you think that someone who is going to be teaching Indigenous literature, what should they know? How should they prepare?
So my graduate, my PhD supervisor had this phrase, read promiscuously. And I've always loved that phrase. And I never understood how she did it as a teacher, because it's just befuddling to me, but she would have like 30 books at the bookstore. She said, choose 5 of them. And then so they would all choose different ones. And like, I can't understand how that worked. Apparently it did. Her students had a great time, but that was her philosophy, was just read widely. Don't worry about these kind of arbitrary ideas of quality. Don't worry about these arbitrary ideas of whatever. Find works that spark your imagination and your curiosity, and read widely. So find the books that are on the bestseller list. Find the ones that are kind of hidden away. Find the ones that are dealing with topical issues like Waub's work on climate change. Find works that are, we've got some awesome vampire novels by Indigenous people, right? We've even got werewolf novels by Indigenous people now. We don't need Twilight appropriationists, right? So you find all these different works. We've got romance, we've got queer Indigenous poetry, we've got love poetry out there, and just read widely. And then I think the more you do that, the more you get a sense of what you want people to get out of it. Is it enough to just say, read an Indigenous writer? Well, then it's a checklist. Be transformed by Indigenous literature is a different thing entirely, and that's what we're asking for. So read promiscuously, follow the story, and then you'll find the writers who you, as a teacher who's in touch with what your students are thinking and the world that they're in and the fears that they have and the interests that they have, you'll find the writers who really can speak to those things in meaningful ways. I'm really allergic to this idea that you have to have a canonical list of Indigenous writers. We are too diverse for that. So find the writers who are going to be compelling and interesting to your students and to you as well as a reader. And that will be how we affect change. But if we just are like, you have to read Indigenous writers because you need to know about Indigenous stuff because it's expected, we don't learn well that way as adults. Why on earth would our students?
And it's okay not to particularly be fond of an Indigenous author, just the same as I was never fond of Thomas Hardy in The Mayor of Casterbridge, which I thought was a colossal waste of time and effort, but it was part of the canon. So,
Yep.
but it's okay, as you say, if, as long as people are reading promiscuously and looking at a variety of, of topics and titles, it's okay if one doesn't suit their fancy. They shouldn't feel guilty about that.
Absolutely. I don't love everything that's written by an Indigenous writer,
No.
but I appreciate the work that they put into it.
Yes.
There are works that I think are really beautiful in certain ways and really difficult in other ways, and I don't need to be torn about that. I mean, we're as diverse as any other crew, and some people I love, other people don't love, and they're allowed to be wrong.
Um, um, I heard you use the word appropriate very briefly, and I also heard you use Joseph Boyden's name, and not that they have been linked in our popular culture, but when I'm asked to recommend books that I think would be really good, ground for people who are really interested in Indigenous literature, I've suggested a number of Joseph Boyden's, and there's, again, we talked earlier about people being afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing, and all the public furor about pretendians has really created some ambivalence among educators about whether he is somehow on a banned list or forbidden list. I'm interested in your thoughts about the whole appropriation issue when it comes to literature.
Yeah, I don't believe in banning books, but I think we have to think very hard about who we are cutting out when we're valorizing other people. So, there are really amazing writers who are non-Indigenous, who are writing about Indigenous people. And I'm glad that they are writing good things, whatever. But about 95% of stuff that's ever been written about Indigenous peoples is from non-Indigenous people. And we are not in an age where we need to be represented by other people. We are more than capable of representing ourselves now. And I don't care how good a writer somebody like Joseph Boyden is. I think it matters that there are other writers who got pushed off the stage because he was valorized. And whatever people's ideas are about his identity, I have my thoughts, and they're probably pretty obvious what those thoughts are. But at the end of the day, he took a lot of opportunities that could have gone to Indigenous women, to Two-Spirit folks, to folks who didn't have that platform. And that was not a platform that expanded under him. It was a platform that shrank. So let's just be really clear about that. The writers that I really love are the ones who actually make the stage bigger, not limit it to the size that they're standing on. So for me, appropriation is a problem in a lot of ways. I mean, and I'm also Cherokee, and in the States, all the joke is all white people have a great-great-grandmother who's a Cherokee princess. And if you're Cherokee who looks like me, you just have to deal with that, right? But the reality is there are a lot of people who claim to be Cherokee who aren't. And there are a lot of people who believe that they are, but there's no evidence. And I think there's a difference between people who are being mercenary and between people who sincerely believe a story that doesn't have evidence. And I have some sympathy for the latter. I don't have any sympathy for the former. But I think when we get into this point about who has the right, who is authorized, is there a list of banned books? I think that again is turning the subject in a colonial way. It's not about whether we have the right to do this work, it's what are our responsibilities if we're going to do this work. And if your responsibility is to your singular career, but not to the community that you claim to be writing with and representing in your work, then there's a problem there. And I don't care whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. What are your responsibilities in the work that you're doing? So for me, when I think about appropriation, I think it often becomes a really colonial question. Because well, do who has the right? Well, that's the wrong question. I don't care who has the right. The right is a different issue. What are you doing with the responsibilities that you have as a writer and as a teacher? And if you're not actually being a responsible writer, then something is awry there. I think it does matter what the integrity of our stories and where we come from. But again, we also have to be careful that we're not expecting all Indigenous people to have this singular experience, that there's only one way of being Indigenous, that there's only one way of being Cherokee or Anishinaabe or whatever. But that a lot of us have messy stories. And rather than try to create stories that somehow fit this pre-existing script, because I think some of the folks who've gotten in trouble, they've started to try to explain away the messiness rather than just to accept the fact that there's messiness. Just understand, we're after centuries of colonialism that has targeted family structures and communities and identities. There's a lot of mess out there, and it's okay that we have messiness in our experiences. And I am not here to represent all Cherokee people. I can't. I'm also learning from people who were raised culturally and with those experiences. So I have a lot more I could say about that, and I know we need to move on. But I think we need to get out of the question of who has the right, because that's where we get to academic freedom or the right of the writer to write about whatever they want. But like, why are you writing this? And what are your responsibilities in doing that? And if you don't think you have responsibilities as a writer, then you're a dangerous person. And I think we have ways of dealing with dangerous people. And it's not about killing them, but it's also about making clear what their danger is to our families and to our communities. And I think that's also important. Typically, these stories, these don't become front page stories overnight. People have tried quiet, culturally appropriate ways of asking questions and dealing with issues. And when people are unwilling to be corrected, that's where things start to expand. But typically these folks are not victims. They've done a lot of work for a long time not answering questions. So anyway, sorry, I could keep going, but I won't.
Listen, I really appreciate your comments there. In a sea of really hostile verbosity, I think what you've just said is one of the most meaningful comments I've heard on the topic. I appreciate very much. And I have to make a confession, and Jody will smile. You referred being it's almost a cliche that people that want to point to the fact they've got some Indigenous heritage will say that they have a great grandmother or grandfather that was Cherokee. In the course of doing my family tree last month, I found out that the Muskrat family that my grandfather, whose name my grandfather had from the Mississauga or Michissauga, that he had a grandfather from Georgia that was a Cherokee.
We did get around. I will also admit that. It's not like we stuck down there.
So Jody said he wasn't a prince, was he? I said no, it wasn't a prince. So I've come out publicly with that. So, but it was
one of the best stories I ever had with that was I was introduced to a Cherokee woman, and she was raised in knowing her family, culturally and stuff, and I was introduced to her by a mutual friend, and she kind of looked at me and I said, "Yeah, but no princesses in my background." And she said, "Yeah, but there were probably a couple of queens back there, huh, Daniel?" I was like, oh, "Okay, we're good. So I am not descended from princesses, but I've known a few queens in my time.
Well, I'm looking at the question list. I think I've touched them all. Oh no, there was one early on. I think you've answered them, and this speaks to kind of that reticence that I have encountered, and I'm sure you do with non-Indigenous people being kind of nervous, even if we're granting them anonymity to ask a question. But I'll ask you this one. I don't. Well, I think Wob maybe had to, had to go to parental ability. Can you share with us, Daniel, what books are on your nightstand right now?
Oh yes, absolutely. I just got well, I've read it in a different version, but I've got Joshua Whitehead's Making Love with the Land, which is a stunning, stunning book. It's over on my shelf over there, but Billy Ray Belcourt's newest book, a novel, A Minor Chorus. And then this book by Leanne Simpson and Robin Maynard, Rehearsals for Living, which is actually a conversation between an Anishinaabe writer and a Black writer, talking about the intersected histories and the complicated histories between Black people and Indigenous people in this country. This one I'm really looking forward to reading as well. So,
and I have to ask you, who your which non-Indigenous writers had an influence on you?
oh my gosh, so many. I mean, but one who I always come back to is J.R.R. Tolkien. Octavia Butler would be another one, an amazing Black fantasist. Ursula K. Le Guin, a white fantasist who is also the daughter of a very famous and problematic anthropologist. Oh, so many, so many. Yeah. Gloria Anzaldúa. I could keep going, but I've been very blessed to have so many brilliant storytellers and to have access to so many brilliant storytellers.
And again, just as we're wrapping up here, I'm interested. You have your own opinions about what this phrase reconciliation means. Can you tell us, in the context of of your the work you do about literature, how important is the role of Indigenous literatures to reconciliation?
I think we have to just kind of figure out what we mean by reconciliation before I could even answer that question. I think if it's about reconciling ourselves to the existing status quo, then I don't think Indigenous literatures help much. If it's about helping us live in better, more just, more thoughtful, and more ethical ways, I think Indigenous literatures are central to that work. But if you're just looking to check off a box and say, "Oh, I read an Indigenous writer," that's not going to do the work. But if you actually are interested in a transformation in those relationships and those possibilities, I think Indigenous literature is central to that. And we have amazing writers doing this work now, and have had those writers doing this work for a very, very long time. So don't just stop at the writers working today, look backward, because they have been the elders who have been writing these things. Like I've been reading some stuff from the 1930s, and they were saying some of the same things and had the same hopes and dreams of what writing could do, even back in that time, as we're doing right now. So I think know what you mean by reconciliation. And I do have one children's book. So my colleague Dallas Hunt, Awasis and the World Famous Bannock from Portage and Maine Press. I was trying to think of the one. It's an awesome book, and I think I pronounced that right. The Cree speakers will correct me, I hope. By Dallas Hunt and Amanda Strong. Great story about a world famous bannock. So I highly recommend that book for young readers.
And I didn't ask a question about this. Again, it's become almost a stereotype that Indigenous peoples have only used the spoken word. We were writing petroglyphs before thousands of years before Egyptians were writing hieroglyphs. And we had scrolls, as I think you mentioned in your book, Birch Bark Scrolls. And if I'm mistaken, the Cherokee had a newspaper before the Globe and Mail, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, our newspaper dates to the 1820s.
Yeah. So we knew how to write. We knew how to communicate with people who were around us. Always. So.
And our printing press was
Daniel,
directly attacked. That was part of the assault on our nation, was to destroy the printing press because it was too dangerous a symbol.
wow. Well, listen, I really appreciate you answering these questions. That's a lot of work answering questions, and again, your book, you have nothing to, you didn't fall short in any way. You raised some interesting questions, and again, why Indigenous literatures matter. I love the fact you put an S on literatures matter. And Daniel Heath Justice, I congratulate you on producing something that I think is an appropriate textbook for for anybody who wants to learn more about about Indigenous writers and storytellers. And Miigwech, thanks very much for being here. And I'm going to ask Jody if she would say some words.
Wado, thank you.
So I'm just going to echo Morris. What an incredible discussion tonight. So many, I'm sure, I don't know if any of you are Twitter people, but I'm sure there may be some Twitter quotes coming out of tonight, because it was just so rich and such an important conversation. I'm just going to talk about a few logistical things and we'll do our draw. And I do want to, so there's been some questions about recording. Is this going to be recorded? And I just want to make sure, Daniel, that it's okay with you. Wob is okay with this to be posted for 1 month. We'll keep it up for 1 month if you're okay with that.
Yeah, I don't mind.
Okay, great. And I just wanted to kind of model this question for people out there, because it's another area of consideration that often gets missed, in that we need to make sure that we ask permission for things, especially, for an example, we're doing this webinar. If you're ever working with Indigenous people or communities, always ask for permission for whatever it is that you're doing, and don't make assumptions that you can just take or extract out what is being shared with you. So it's always just a good practice. So I'm going to just share my screen. So the recording we'll put up on our website, and it's actually the same YouTube link that was shared out through the Eventbrite page, but we'll share that in a follow-up email. So again, these things are coming up. If you haven't registered for them, I'll just put these links in the chat box for you so that you can see. So the rest of our conversations with Wob, and as Morris mentioned, he had to duck out to take care of his little ones and get them off to bed. The next, we have another webinar that's coming up on October 5th. For those of you in secondary, of course, anybody really could attend these, of course, but this is focusing on a new secondary resource. It's a digital resource, and we'll be showcasing that. So I'll put this in the chat box as well for you if you're interested. It is Treaty Week will be coming up soon, the first full week in November. And so this is a great webinar if you want to check out the latest for treaty education. So I'm just going to put this in the chat box for you. And then I don't know if there's anyone here who may be an OECTA member. So that is the Catholic Educators Union. Also has a series coming out that's based on our video series called In Our Words. And it's a series we'll be going through that and breaking it down into its components and having some discussion around the different videos. And it's basically walks through the dispossession of land and those impacts that are today. And it there's opportunities where it connects into the grade 7-8 curriculum as well as secondary. So those are some upcoming events. And I just want to point out a brand new on our website. I'll just show you where you can find this. So under our members only section, now, if you're not a member, you can become a member, but a lot of school boards have memberships. So if you're not sure, please reach out. There's a contact button on the website to inquire if your board already has a board license. And so you would have access to this members only section. So in here, this is a new page that we've just started building. And in here, you will find a document that has been created in a partnership with ELAN, which is the English Language Arts Network. And so you can scroll through and find all kinds of guidelines in different areas when you're thinking about Indigenous literatures in the classroom. So I recommend that you check that out. We also have some recommended educator resource and guides, and you can, if you want to pop this deck out, you can click here and it'll pop it out there. So again, you'll see why Indigenous Literatures Matters is recommended here. And then just some pieces that we'll be building on is also in here. So considerations for text selection that you can look at. So, and a few other things. So I'll leave that with you to peruse. And lastly is we will be doing our giveaway. So the moment has arrived. Thank you to everybody who has entered to win. So we have 225 entries. So we're going to give away 3 of each book. So we're going to spin the wheel 9 times. And we will contact you via email. So the first winner here, I hope I pronounced your name right, Fabiha. Okay, and the next one, Lindsay. Okay, so, and Jillian, so you 3 are the lucky winners of Daniel's book. So we will be sending you all out copies of his book. And the next 3 will be for Morris's book, We Are All Treaty People. And the first winner is Angela. And the second winner of We Are All Treaty Book, or We Are All Treaty People by Morris is Patricia. Okay, and the last person to get a copy of We Are All Treaty People is Jische. I'm so sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. All right, and the last 3 books are Waub's book, Moon of the Crusted Snow. So let's see who are the winners. Mike, you will be getting a book. Serena, and the last person who will be receiving a book for Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig Rice will be Nancy. Well, thank you everyone for attending tonight. And I hope that you'll join in our next session coming up with Waubgeshig Rice and Rosanna Deerchild to continue this important conversation. I want to thank Morris for being here and supporting the work that we do as well. And Tina, who's behind the scenes helping support this. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes. And of course, our special guest, Daniel, what an absolute joy having you on. I'm sure everyone is going to be walking away with a lot of thinking and certainly inspiration to pick up the incredible literature that exists out there and dive in it promiscuously.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Okay, so good night, everyone. Thank you again. Stay safe, and we'll see you on the next one.